It's Sega Rookie. But first, before I start, I must plug in my charger. Okay, good. Now let's get going. Oh, well, now you know about what's happening. Oh no, a zombie. Go, Potato Mind, go. I choose you. Yard. Oh no, zombie at line 2 or 4. Whatever. Us, but down. Dun, dun. Mm, uh, mm, mm, Plants vs. Zombies is an amazing game. You have to stop the zombies from eating your brains. You must go show them your name. We're amazing. You have a picture to shoot and a sunflower to give you sun. Picture acts like a gun. Oh crap! I accidentally did that, and I deserve a slap. Ouch, why did I do that? I'm such a weirdo. Why am I even singing this song? This is going wrong. Somebody help me please sing really better. All I need to do is see splatter and then the nether. Ugh. Hey, why is that dude has his tongue out? Oh well. Yes, we got the person who says no in this no in orange. Victory explosion, yeah! Now for Snoopy's personality, he's obsessed with anime. It's as annoying as neck and, you know, yawn. I'm bored. Because I'm so bored, I guess we're just going to have to use that SpongeBob time slap. Okay, we're just going to use literally all the time cards.
2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later. 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later.